The alarm on her phone did its job at 6:30 a.m., just as it always did. It wasn't a harsh, jarring sound, but a gentle, repeating chime that was designed to ease a person into wakefulness. For her, it was just the first note in a song she had heard 1,000 times. She reached out from under the warm duvet, her hand finding the small, cool rectangle of glass on her bedside table without even looking. She silenced it. The room was still dim, filtered with the soft gray light that comes just before the sun truly commits to rising. For a moment, she just lay there staring at the ceiling. It was a plain white ceiling, smooth and unbroken. She knew every inch of it. It was the ceiling of her life, she sometimes thought. Clean, tidy, and completely empty of anything interesting. She swung her legs out of bed, her feet landing perfectly on the plush gray rug she had positioned there for that exact purpose. No cold shocks, no surprises. Her apartment was a testament to order. Everything had its place. The books on the shelf were arranged by color, then by size. The kitchen counters were clear, save for the coffee maker and a single perfectly placed ceramic mug. It was a beautiful space, one that looked like it belonged in a magazine, but it didn't feel like a home. It felt like a showroom for a life she was supposed to want. She moved through her morning routine with the quiet efficiency of a machine. A quick shower, water set to the exact temperature she liked. She brushed her teeth while staring out the small bathroom window at the brick wall of the adjacent building. A red brick, a gray mortar line, another red brick. She could probably count them all if she had the time. Getting dressed was a simple affair. Her wardrobe was organized not by color but by function. Work clothes on the left, weekend clothes on the right. She selected a pair of dark gray trousers and a simple cream-colored blouse. It was professional, it was safe, and it required absolutely no thought. That was the goal. To think as little as possible. Thinking, she had learned, was a dangerous sport. It led to questions, and questions were like loose threads. If you pulled on one, the whole neat fabric of your existence could start to unravel. She grabbed her bag and her keys from the small bowl by the door, the metal clinking softly in the quiet apartment. She locked the door behind her, the deadbolt sliding home with a satisfying solid thud. It was the sound of security, the sound of her own little safe box being sealed up for the day. The hallway was silent as it always was. Her neighbors were just shapes behind other closed doors. She took the elevator down to the lobby, nodding a silent greeting to the doorman whose name she could never remember. He nodded back, his face a mask of polite indifference. Outside, the city was already awake. It was a beast of noise and motion, a river of yellow taxis and hurried footsteps. She fell into the current, just another drop of water flowing in the same direction as everyone else. She didn't have to navigate. She just had to keep moving. The path to the subway was etched into her muscle memory. She walked the same 3 blocks, past the same storefronts, and dodged the same cracks in the pavement. She saw the same man selling newspapers, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, and the same woman walking her tiny, yapping dog. They were all part of the scenery, the static backdrop to the movie of her life. The coffee shop on the corner was her first real interaction of the day. The bell above the door chimed, a sound as familiar as her own heartbeat. "The usual?" the young woman behind the counter asked, not even looking up from the machine she was wiping down. "Please," she replied. That was the extent of their conversation. It was the same conversation they had every single weekday. She didn't know the woman's name, and the woman didn't know hers. They were just roles in a play, the customer and the barista. She paid with a tap of her card, the machine beeping its approval, and waited patiently for her black coffee, no sugar, no milk. It was fuel, not a treat. While she waited, she pulled out her phone. Her thumb, with a will of its own, navigated to the familiar icons. She opened her social media apps and began to scroll. It was a window into 1,000 other lives, lives that seemed to be bursting with color and light. There was a photo of a former college friend standing on a mountaintop, arms outstretched, a huge grin on her face. The caption read something about chasing sunsets and finding yourself. She felt a small, sharp pang in her chest. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was more like a sense of loss, a mourning for a life she didn't know how to live. She kept scrolling. A cousin's new baby, a coworker's engagement party, pictures from a beach vacation, plates of beautifully arranged food in exotic restaurants. Everyone was living. Everyone was experiencing, and she was just watching. It was like being at a party where everyone else was laughing and dancing, and she was standing in the corner, separated by an invisible wall. She could see them, she could hear them, but she couldn't join in. Her coffee was ready. She took the cup, the warmth a small comfort in her hand, and continued her journey to the subway station. The air grew thicker as she descended the stairs, heavy with the smell of damp concrete and too many people in a confined space. The train arrived with a screech of metal on metal and a rush of hot, forced air. She found a small slice of empty space to stand in, holding her bag close to her body. She didn't look at anyone. It was an unspoken rule of the commute. You kept your eyes to yourself, your head down, creating a small private bubble in the public chaos. She stared at an advertisement for a new smartphone, its bright colors and smiling models a stark contrast to the tired, blank faces of the people around her. The train lurched and swayed, a rhythmic clatter that was the city's heartbeat. She felt the familiar vibration travel up from the soles of her feet, through her legs and into her bones. She was a part of this machine, a cog in its vast, impersonal engine. Her office building was a tower of glass and steel that stabbed at the sky. She showed her ID to the security guard, another silent transaction, and rode the elevator up to the 15th floor. The design agency where she worked was all clean lines and minimalist furniture. It was quiet, save for the gentle tapping of keyboards and the occasional low murmur of a voice from a phone call. She sat at her desk, a neat island in a sea of other neat islands. Her computer screen glowed to life. Her inbox was already full of requests. Need a new logo concept for the quarterly report. Can we tweak the color on the Henderson campaign? Client wants it more blue. Please review the final mock-ups for the website. They were just words, just tasks. She opened a program and began to work. She moved shapes around a screen. She adjusted fonts. She played with color palettes. She was good at her job. She had a good eye for what looked professional, what was clean and modern, but she felt nothing. She could have been designing a logo for a company that saved puppies or one that sold weapons, and it wouldn't have made a difference to the process. It was all just pixels on a screen. The hours bled into one another. She would get so absorbed in the tiny details of her work that she would forget to eat lunch, or she would eat a sad salad at her desk while still clicking and dragging. Sometimes she would look up and realize the light outside her window had changed, that the bright sun of midday had softened into the golden glow of late afternoon. The day was gone, and she had barely noticed its passing. At 5 o'clock, a quiet chime went off on her computer. It was her signal to stop. She saved her files, shut down her programs, and logged off. She said a few quiet goodbyes to her colleagues as she left, but they were just formalities. She didn't know about their lives outside of these walls, and they didn't know about hers. The commute home was the reverse of the morning. The same river of people flowing in the opposite direction. The same silent subway ride, the same tired faces. Back in her apartment, the silence rushed in to greet her. It was a different kind of silence than the one in the morning. The morning silence was full of potential. The evening silence was full of emptiness. She dropped her bag by the door, the keys clattering into the bowl. She went to the kitchen and took a container of pre-made soup from the refrigerator. She poured it into a pot and heated it on the stove, watching the small bubbles break the surface. She ate it standing up, leaning against the counter, scrolling through her phone again. More pictures, more stories of other people's adventures. She saw a post from a friend who had just started a pottery class. There was a picture of her hands covered in wet clay, a misshapen but beautiful bowl taking shape in her palms. The caption was simple, "Making something with my own hands. It feels so real." She put her phone down, a sudden wave of sadness washing over her. When was the last time she had made something that felt real? Everything she did was digital, ephemeral. It could be deleted with a single click. It had no weight, no substance. She finished her soup, rinsed the bowl, and placed it in the dishwasher. She tidied up the already tidy living room, fluffing the cushions on the sofa and wiping a smudge from the glass coffee table. It was busy work. It was something to do to fill the time, to push back the quiet feeling of being completely and utterly alone. She wasn't lonely in the way that a person who has no one is lonely. She had friends of a sort. She could call them, and they would go out for a drink or a meal. They would talk about their jobs, their relationships, the TV shows they were watching, but the conversations felt like they were being read from a script. She would ask the right questions, and they would give the right answers. No one ever said what they were really thinking. No one ever said, "I'm scared," or "I feel like I'm wasting my life," or "Is this all there is?" She knew she certainly never did. She sat down on the sofa, the gray fabric cool against her skin. She picked up the remote and turned on the television, flipping through the channels until she found a show where people argued about cooking. She watched the screen, But she wasn't really seeing it. Her mind was somewhere else, adrift in a sea of vague dissatisfaction. She had everything she was supposed to have. A good job, a nice apartment, a life that was stable and secure. She had built walls around herself, and she had done a very good job of it. The walls were strong, and they kept her safe. But she was beginning to realize that walls don't just keep things out. They also keep you in. She was a prisoner in a fortress of her own making, and the worst part was she couldn't remember why she had ever built it in the first place. She just knew she was tired of the view. The clock on her computer screen finally clicked over to 5, and she felt the familiar, gentle release of pressure like a valve being turned. The day was done. She saved her work, logged off, and gathered her things. The movements as practiced and silent as a dance she had performed 1,000 times. The elevator ride down was a shared, quiet descent with a few others from her floor, all of them avoiding eye contact, lost in the glowing rectangles of their phones. They were a group of individuals, united only by their shared destination and their collective desire to be somewhere else. The city air hit her as she stepped out of the building's glass doors, and it felt different. It was heavier, thicker, charged with a strange energy. The sky, which had been a pale, uninteresting blue all day, had turned a bruised, dramatic shade of purple-gray. A low rumble echoed from somewhere far away, a sound that seemed to vibrate not in her ears but deep in her chest. The rain, when it started, wasn't a gentle sprinkle. It began all at once, as if someone had tipped over a giant bucket directly over the city. The sound was immense, a deafening roar on the pavement and on the roofs of the cars. People who had been walking calmly a moment before suddenly broke into a frantic run, their newspapers and briefcases held over their heads in a futile attempt to stay dry. She stood under the relative safety of the building's awning, watching the chaos unfold. The world was being washed clean, the grime of the day swirling away in rivers on the asphalt. She had no umbrella. It was an oversight, a break in her usually perfect routine. She had a 20-minute walk to the subway station, and it was clear that walk was not going to happen. She could wait it out, she supposed. The rain would probably pass soon, or she could try to call a car, but she knew from experience that on a day like this the wait times would be impossible. So she stood and she watched. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a movie about a city she didn't live in. The rain created a shimmering, distorted curtain between her and the world, blurring the headlights of the passing cars into streaks of red and white. After a few minutes, the initial shock of the downpour began to wear off, and a new feeling started to creep in. It was a feeling of being stuck, of being trapped. The awning was a small island of safety in a vast wet ocean, and she was marooned. She started to feel a prickle of impatience. This was not part of the plan. The plan was to go home, to her quiet, orderly apartment, to her container of soup and her evening of television. This rain was an inconvenience, a flaw in the fabric of her day. She looked up and down the street, searching for an escape. And that's when she saw it. Tucked between a loud, brightly lit pharmacy and a bank with its harsh fluorescent lighting was a small storefront she had never noticed before. There was no flashy sign, no window display trying to sell her anything. There was just a simple wooden door with a small brass handle and a single unlit window. Peeking through the rain-streaked glass, she could just make out the shapes of what looked like books. A bookstore. It was a relic, something that didn't quite belong in this modern, fast-paced street. It was like finding a smooth gray stone on a beach of colorful plastic. Something about it drew her in. It was an option, a choice. She could stay here, under the awning, a passive observer of the storm, or she could take a step quite literally into the unknown. The rain was still coming down in sheets. She took a deep breath, pulled the collar of her blouse up around her neck, and made a run for it. The few feet to the bookstore door felt like a marathon. The cold rain soaked her instantly, her hair plastering to her forehead and her trousers becoming heavy and damp. Her hand found the cold brass of the doorknob and she turned it, pushing her way inside. The bell above the door chimed, a soft melodic sound that was immediately swallowed by the profound silence of the shop. The door swung shut behind her and the roar of the storm was cut off, replaced by a quiet so deep it felt like a physical presence. The air inside was thick with the comforting, dusty smell of old paper and binding glue. It was the smell of time, of stories, of 1,000 different worlds all sleeping on their shelves. She stood there for a moment, dripping onto the worn wooden floorboards, her heart beating a little faster from the sudden dash. She felt a sense of peace settle over her, a feeling she hadn't realized she was craving. This was a place out of time. The shelves were packed from floor to ceiling, a chaotic jumble of books that looked like they had been placed there with love rather than logic. There were no neat categories, no alphabetized sections. It was a treasure hunt. She began to walk slowly down the narrow aisle, her fingers trailing lightly over the spines of the books. They were all different shapes and sizes, their covers faded and worn. She ran her thumb over the embossed lettering on one, the gold leaf flaking off under her touch. She wondered how many hands had held this book before her, how many eyes had read these words. She was so lost in the quiet magic of the place that she almost didn't notice the man standing at the counter near the back. He was older, with a wild shock of white hair and a face that was a roadmap of wrinkles and laugh lines. He was wearing a well-worn cardigan over a button-down shirt, and he was peering at a small leather-bound book through a pair of spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He looked up as she approached, and his eyes, a startlingly bright and kind blue, crinkled at the corners. "Quite a storm out there," he said, his voice a gentle rumbling sound like the purr of a contented cat. "It is," she replied, her own voice sounding small and hesitant in the quiet space. "I hope you weren't caught too far from shelter. Just across the street. I saw your shop and, well, it seemed like a better place to be than under an awning." He smiled, a wide, genuine smile that made his whole face light up. "We aim to provide a better class of shelter," he said. "Can I help you find anything? Or are you just browsing?" "Just browsing, I think," she said. "It's a wonderful place." "It's my life's work," he said with a simple pride that was deeply moving. He placed the book he was reading down on the counter. "Every book in here has a story, you know. Not just the one inside its covers. I know where I got every single one. Who sold it to me, what they said about it. They're like old friends." She felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was the kind of connection she had been missing. This was real. "I can believe that," she said softly. Just then, the bell above the door chimed again and another person hurried in, shaking the rain from their coat. The old man, the shopkeeper, excused himself to go and greet the new arrival. She turned back to the shelves, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just killing time anymore. She was exploring. She found a section of old travel books, their covers filled with faded photographs of exotic places. She pulled one out, a book about a journey through the mountains of a country she couldn't pronounce. She opened it and the pages were filled with elegant cursive handwriting in the margins. A previous owner had been there. They had underlined passages and written little notes in the margins. "Saw this view myself, breathtaking. The tea here is terrible, but the company is good." She was reading a conversation across time, a dialogue with a stranger from another era. She was so engrossed that she didn't notice the shopkeeper approaching until he was right beside her. "Ah, a good choice," he said, peering at the book in her hands. "A lady brought that in last month. Said her grandfather was the one who wrote all those notes. He was an adventurer," she said, "always chasing the next horizon." She looked from the book to the man's kind blue eyes. She felt a sudden overwhelming urge to know more, to hear the story. "That's amazing," she said. "It makes the book feel alive." "That's the secret," he said, leaning in a little closer as if sharing a great truth. "Everything is alive. Everything has a story. You just have to be willing to listen." He was about to say something else when he suddenly stumbled, his foot catching on the edge of a worn rug. He let out a small cry of surprise and his arms flailed out to try and catch his balance. He didn't fall, but the stack of books he had been holding near the counter went flying. They hit the floor with a series of loud, slapping thuds that echoed in the quiet shop. The new customer, a young man with headphones, didn't even look up from his phone. The shopkeeper stood there for a moment, looking flustered and a little embarrassed. "Oh dear," he said, his cheeks flushing slightly. "My old bones aren't as steady as they used to be." He started to bend down to pick up the books, but he moved slowly, his joints clearly stiff. She didn't even think. It was an instinct, a reflex she didn't know she had. She put her own book down and hurried over, kneeling on the floor to help him. "Here, let me," she said, her voice firm and clear. She started gathering the books, her hands moving quickly. They were heavy, with thick, solid covers. One was a history of cartography, another a collection of poetry, a third a biography of a long-dead queen. As she picked them up, she could feel the weight of their stories in her hands. They worked together in silence for a few moments, her quick, efficient movements a stark contrast to his slow, careful ones. When they had gathered them all into a stack, she stood up and held them out to him. He took them from her, his hands brushing against hers for a brief moment. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with a genuine gratitude that touched her deeply. "Thank you so much. That was very kind." "It was nothing," she said, but it wasn't nothing. It was something. It was the first unplanned, spontaneous thing she had done in a very long time. It was a small act of kindness, but it felt like a monumental event. "No," he said, looking her straight in the eye. "It was something. It was a kindness, and those are rarer than you think." He looked at the stack of books in his hands, then back at her. A thoughtful expression crossed his face. "I was just about to make myself a cup of tea to wait out the rest of this rain," he said. "It's the least I can do. Would you care to join me?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. This was it. This was the crossroads. She could say no. She could make an excuse, say she had to get home, and slip back out into the rain and back into her old life. It was the safe option, the predictable option. Or she could say yes. She could step a little further into this unknown world, this world of stories and kindness and blue-eyed old men. She looked at his kind face, at the hopeful expression in his eyes. She thought of her empty apartment, of her container of soup, of the long, silent evening ahead of her. And she made a choice. "I'd like that very much," she said. And just like that, the world began to shift. He led the way, not back towards the front of the shop, but towards a heavy, dark green velvet curtain that hung in a doorway behind the counter. It looked like the kind of curtain you'd find in an old theater, hiding a world of secrets. He pulled it aside with a flourish, revealing a short, narrow hallway. At the end of it was a simple wooden door, which he opened with a familiar, well-worn key. "After you," he said, gesturing for her to enter. She stepped through the doorway and felt another shift in the atmosphere, as if she were passing through another layer of reality. This was the back room, the heart of the shop. It was even more cluttered than the front, but in a cozy, lived-in way. More books were stacked in teetering piles on the floor, on every available surface, and on shelves that sagged in the middle. A small pot-bellied stove glowed a gentle orange in one corner, casting a warm, flickering light across the room. In the opposite corner, there was a small round table covered in a floral tablecloth with two mismatched wooden chairs. An electric kettle sat on a small tray next to a collection of chipped mugs. It was a space that felt completely separate from the world outside, a secret nest hidden away from the rain and the noise. "Please sit," he said, gesturing to the table. "Make yourself at home." The home of a very messy old man, but a home nonetheless. She chose one of the chairs and sat down, placing her damp bag on the floor beside her. She watched as he moved around the small space with a practiced ease. He filled the kettle from a small sink in the corner and plugged it in. He opened a tin that was shaped like a classic red London telephone box and took out 2 tea bags, dropping them into the mugs. "It's just simple black tea, I'm afraid," he said over his shoulder. "Nothing fancy. But it's hot and it's wet, which is what a day like this calls for." "It's perfect," she replied, and she meant it. She felt a sense of calm settling over her, a feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. While the water was heating, he didn't just stand and wait. He picked up one of the books from the pile on his table, the one about cartography that she had helped him pick up. He ran a loving hand over its cover. "This one," he began, his voice taking on that same gentle, rumbling quality as before. "This one is a particular favorite of mine. Not because of the maps themselves, though they are beautiful. It's because of who owned it." He sat down in the other chair, placing the book on the table between them. "The woman who sold it to me, her grandfather was a map maker. A real one. Not someone who just copied other people's maps, but a man who went out into the world and drew what he saw. He told her that a map wasn't just about lines and names. It was about the journey. It was about the blank spaces, the places that said, 'Here be dragons.' He believed those were the most important parts of any map." She leaned forward, her elbows on the table, completely captivated. It wasn't just a story about a book. It was a story about a way of seeing the world. She found herself hanging on his every word, her own quiet world fading into the background. The kettle clicked off, its shrill whistle a brief interruption in the spell he was weaving. He got up to pour the water, the steam rising in a fragrant cloud. He brought the mugs back to the table, placing one carefully in front of her. "Careful now," he said. "It's hot." She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, the heat seeping into her cold fingers. She took a careful sip. It was just simple tea, but it tasted like comfort, like a conversation on a rainy day. He stirred his own tea, the spoon clinking softly against the side of the mug. "You know," he said, his eyes twinkling over the rim of his cup. "That book you were looking at, the travelogue, the one with the notes in the margins. That lady, the one whose grandfather wrote them, she told me something I'll never forget." He paused, taking another sip of his tea. "She said her grandfather used to tell her that the world is full of two kinds of people. There are the people who look at a map and see a list of places to go, and then there are the people who look at a map and see a story waiting to be told." She looked down at her own hands, at the simple, unadorned ring on her finger. She had always been the first kind of person. She saw her life as a list of tasks to be completed, a route to be followed from point A to point B. She had never once considered that she might be the author of her own story. "I think I've always been the first kind of person," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't look surprised. He just nodded, a gentle, understanding smile on his face. "Most people are. It's easier. It's safer. A list of places is concrete. A story is messy. It has unexpected twists and turns. It has villains and heroes, and sometimes you don't know which one you are until the very end." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze becoming distant as if he were looking at something far beyond the small room. "I have a friend," he said, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "A wonderful, brilliant woman. A historian. She spent years of her life researching the life of a woman who was completely forgotten by history. A female explorer from the 1930s. No one had ever heard of her. Her name wasn't in any of the big textbooks. But my friend, she found her diary in a dusty archive in a small town in another country. She spent years translating it, tracing her steps, piecing together this incredible life." He leaned forward again, his eyes bright with passion. This woman, this explorer, she traveled to places no one else would go. She learned languages, she studied cultures. She saw things with her own eyes that people in the West couldn't even imagine. And she wrote it all down, not for fame or for glory, but because she couldn't not write it. The story was inside her and it had to get out. She was mesmerized. It was the most passionate, the most alive she had ever heard another person be. He wasn't just telling a story. He was living it, reliving it right there in front of her. She could see the dusty archive. She could feel the excitement of the discovery. She could feel the frustration and the triumph of her friend's long quest. "My friend," he continued, "she says that this forgotten explorer taught her the most important lesson of all. She taught her that everyone has a story. Every single person. The person who sells you your coffee, the person you sit next to on the subway, the person you walk past in the street. They all have a story, a history, a world of experiences and dreams and heartbreaks that is just as rich and as complex as your own. We just don't take the time to listen." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth. She thought of all the faces she saw every day, the faces she deliberately ignored. The man selling newspapers, the woman with the yapping dog. They were just part of the scenery, background characters in the movie of her life. But what if they weren't? What if they were the main characters in their own movies and she was just a blur in their background? The thought was both humbling and exhilarating. They sat in silence for a while, just drinking their tea and listening to the sound of the rain still drumming on the roof above them. It was a comfortable silence, a shared silence. It wasn't empty. It was full of the stories he had told, full of the thoughts they had sparked in her mind. She felt a shift happening inside her, a subtle but profound realignment. It was as if a dusty window in her mind had been wiped clean, and for the first time she was seeing the world with a new clarity. She finished her tea and placed the mug back on the table. "Thank you," she said, and she knew she wasn't just talking about the tea. "For the tea and for the stories." He smiled, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's my pleasure," he said. "Like I said, it's what I do." He looked at her for a long moment, a thoughtful, considering look on his face. "You know," he said slowly, "we have a little gathering here. Every week. On Wednesday evenings. It's nothing formal. Just a few people who get together to share stories." She felt a flutter of nervous excitement in her stomach. "What kind of stories?" she asked. "All kinds," he said. "Someone might bring a poem they love. Someone might tell a story from their childhood. Someone might share a piece of history they've been researching. We have a retired baker who tells the best stories about the secret lives of yeast. We have a young student who shares folk tales from her grandmother's village. There are no rules. The only requirement is that you have a story to share, or that you're willing to listen to one." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "The world is starving for real stories," he said, his voice soft but intense. "Not just content, not just updates, real messy human stories. We get together to feed each other." The invitation hung in the air between them, a shimmering, fragile thing. It was a door standing slightly ajar. On the other side was a world she didn't know. A world of connection and community. A world where people listened to each other. It was everything she had been craving and everything she was terrified of. It was unpredictable. It was messy. It was the opposite of the safe, ordered life she had so carefully constructed. Her first instinct, the old instinct, was to politely decline, to make an excuse about work or about being busy. It was the safe path, the familiar path. But then she looked at his kind, hopeful face. She thought of the forgotten explorer, of the baker and his yeast, of the student and her folk tales. She thought of the feeling of the old book in her hands, of the weight of its story. She thought of the quiet, profound loneliness of her own life, and she knew she couldn't go back to it. Not now that she knew there was another way to live. "I would like that very much," she said, her voice clear and steady. A wide, brilliant smile spread across his face. "Wonderful," he said. "Simply wonderful. Next Wednesday, then. 7 o'clock. Don't be late." He stood up and she stood with him. The rain had finally stopped, and a pale, watery sunlight was beginning to filter through the small, grimy window at the back of the room. "It looks like the storm has passed," he said. "It seems that way," she replied. And as she followed him back through the velvet curtain and out into the now quiet shop, she knew that he wasn't just talking about the weather. The week that followed felt different. The days still had the same shape, the same rhythm of alarm clock and subway, of keyboard and screensaver. But something inside her had shifted. It was a subtle change, like the almost imperceptible lightening of the sky just before the sun rises. The world hadn't changed, but her perception of it had. On her walk to the subway, she found herself not just looking, but seeing. She saw the man who sold newspapers not as a static part of the scenery, but as a person. She wondered about his story. Where did he go when he folded up his stand? Did he have a family waiting for him? Did he dream of a different life? She didn't know the answers, but for the first time she was asking the questions. The faces on the subway were no longer a blank, anonymous mass. They were a collection of individual stories, each person a book with a cover she had yet to open. She saw a young woman with tear-streaked cheeks staring out at the dark tunnel, and felt a pang of empathy instead of a flicker of annoyance. She saw an old man with a worn-out violin case, and she wondered what kind of music he played, and who he played it for. At work, the tasks were the same, but her approach to them had changed. She was designing a logo for a new organic grocery chain, a project she would have previously tackled with detached professionalism. But now, as she moved shapes and adjusted fonts, she found herself thinking about the story behind the brand. It wasn't just about looking natural and healthy. It was about the farmers who grew the food, about the families who would eat it. She started to incorporate small, subtle details into the design, tiny flourishes that hinted at growth and community. It was a small change, one that her boss probably wouldn't even notice, but it made the work feel less empty. It felt like she was adding a sentence to a story, rather than just arranging letters on a page. As Wednesday drew closer, a nervous energy began to build inside her. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time, a mix of excitement and dread. What if she didn't fit in? What if she had nothing to say? What if they all saw her for the boring, storyless person she felt she was? The old fear, the fear of the invisible wall, tried to creep back in. But she pushed it away, remembering the old man's kind eyes and his passionate words. The only requirement is that you have a story to share, or that you're willing to listen to one. She could listen. She could definitely do that. On Wednesday evening, she stood in front of the bookstore, her heart beating a little faster than usual. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside, and the familiar, comforting smell of old paper enveloped her. The old man was behind the counter, and when he saw her, his face broke into a wide, welcoming smile. "You came," he said, his voice filled with genuine pleasure. "I wasn't sure if you would." "I said I would," she replied, a small smile touching her own lips. "So I did." "Good," he said. "Very good. They're already here. Just go on through. You know the way." She walked towards the green velvet curtain, her hands feeling a little clammy. She took a deep breath, pulled it aside, and stepped into the back room. It was transformed. The small pot-bellied stove was glowing brightly, casting a warm, inviting light. The round table was now covered in a steaming pot of tea, a plate of cookies, and a collection of mismatched mugs. And around the table sat 4 people, all turned to look at her as she entered. For a moment she froze, a deer in the headlights. This was it, the point of no return. But then the old man came in behind her, and he made the introductions with a simple, easy grace that immediately put her at ease. "Everyone, this is our new friend," he said. "She's the one who helped me with my little tumble the other day." A woman with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a loose bun smiled at her. "We're so glad you could make it," she said. "It's always wonderful to have a new voice." "I'm not sure I have a voice," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Or a story." "Nonsense, Num," said a man with a big bushy beard and a flour dusting on his sweater. "Everyone has a story. You just have to know how to look for it. I'm a baker, by the way. My story is usually about sourdough." She found a chair and sat down, accepting a mug of tea that was handed to her. She felt shy and awkward, like the new kid at school, but no one seemed to mind her quietness. They just welcomed her into their circle, making space for her both physically and emotionally. The gathering began without any formalities. The baker, the one with the flour on his sweater, started things off. He talked about the life of a sourdough starter, the mother that he had been feeding and caring for over 10 years. He described it with such passion, such love, that it sounded like he was talking about a member of his family. He spoke of its moods, its appetites, its fragility, and its resilience. It was a story about bread, but it was also a story about patience and nurturing and the magic of creation. She listened, completely captivated. She had never thought of bread as a story before. Next, a young woman, no older than 20, with bright pink hair and a notebook covered in stickers, shared a folk tale from her grandmother's village. It was a strange and beautiful story about a girl who could talk to the moon, and it was filled with imagery and wisdom that felt ancient and powerful. When she finished, there was a moment of shared silence, a collective appreciation for the world she had brought into the room. Then the woman with the kind eyes, the one who had welcomed her, shared a memory from her childhood. It was a simple story about a summer day spent with her father, fishing in a small creek. It wasn't a dramatic story, there were no great adventures or profound revelations, but it was told with such love and detail that everyone in the room was right there with her, feeling the sun on their skin and hearing the buzz of the insects in the tall grass. It was a story about a moment, a small, perfect moment that had stayed with her for over 50 years. She listened to them all, her heart swelling with a feeling she couldn't quite name. It was a feeling of connection, of belonging. These were her people, she realized. People who saw the magic in the everyday, who understood that the smallest things could hold the greatest meaning. She didn't say much that first night. She just listened. And in listening, she felt a part of her that had been closed off for years begin to open up, like a flower unfurling its petals to the sun. She started to go back every week. It became the highlight of her 7 days, the anchor in her sea of routine. At first, she just listened, but slowly, tentatively, she started to share. One week, she told a story about a funny thing her cat used to do when she was a little girl. The next week, she shared a memory of a trip to the beach with her parents. They were small stories, insignificant in the grand scheme of things, but when she told them, the others listened with the same rapt attention they gave to everyone else. They asked questions. They laughed. They saw the story in what she had to say, and in their eyes she started to see herself differently. She started to realize that her life wasn't a blank page. It was a book that was already being written, filled with its own small, quiet chapters. This newfound perspective began to bleed into every aspect of her life. Her work, which had once felt like a chore, started to feel like a craft. She began to take on freelance projects on the side, small jobs for local businesses and non-profits that couldn't afford a big agency. She designed a logo for a small independent coffee shop, spending hours talking to the owner about his dream, about the community he wanted to create. The design she came up with was warm and inviting, with a little hidden story in its lines. She created a poster for a local animal shelter, using her skills to tell the stories of the animals who needed a home. It was work that paid less, but it fed her soul in a way her corporate job never had. One evening, a few months after her first visit to the salon, she was working on a project for a client who ran a small community-supported farm. She was designing a series of labels for their produce, and she wanted to do more than just make them look nice. She wanted to tell their story. She spent a day at the farm, talking to the farmers, getting her hands dirty, learning about the rhythm of their lives. She came back with a head full of ideas and a heart full of inspiration. As she sat at her desk that night sketching out designs, she looked around her apartment. It was no longer the sterile, minimalist space it had once been. It was filled with books, some from the old man's shop, some from other places she had discovered. Her desk was covered in sketches and notes and paint splatters. A small, slightly misshapen pot she had made in a beginner's pottery class sat on her windowsill, holding a small, thriving succulent. The space was no longer a showroom. It was a home. It was a reflection of her, a work in progress. She looked at the label she was designing, a little drawing of a sun rising over a field. It was simple, but it was full of meaning. It was full of story, and she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she couldn't go back. She couldn't go back to the empty logos and the meaningless tasks. She had to do this. She had to tell stories. The next day she walked into her boss's office and quit. It was terrifying and it was exhilarating. It was the biggest, messiest, most unpredictable thing she had ever done. It was stepping off the map and into the blank space, the place where the dragons were. She didn't have a plan, not really. She had some savings, a handful of clients, and a head full of ideas. But she also had something more important. She had a community. She had a voice. And she had a story to tell. The world she now inhabited was no longer a monochrome routine. It was a vibrant, chaotic, beautiful tapestry of stories, and she was no longer just a spectator. She was a weaver, adding her own threads, her own colors to the grand design. A year had passed since the rainy day that had changed everything. She no longer thought of her life in terms of routines, but in terms of stories. Her work was now a joy, a constant process of discovery. She had a small but growing list of clients who came to her not just for a design, but for a narrative. She had just finished a series of illustrations for a children's book, a story about a lonely firefly who learns that its own light is enough to guide the way. Drawing it had felt like drawing a map of her own journey. Her apartment was no longer a quiet, orderly box. It was a vibrant, lived-in space, filled with the beautiful chaos of a creative life. Books were stacked in colorful towers on the floor. Half-finished paintings leaned against the walls, and the windowsill was a jungle of thriving plants. It was a space that breathed, a space that had a story to tell. On a bright, sunny afternoon, she decided to take her sketchbook to the park. It was one of those perfect days with a gentle breeze and a sky so blue it looked like it had been painted. She found a spot on a bench under a large old oak tree, its leaves dappling the sunlight in shifting patterns on the ground. She opened her sketchbook, but for a long time she didn't draw. She just sat and she watched. She watched a young couple having a picnic, their laughter carrying on the breeze. She watched an old man teaching his grandson how to fly a kite, the bright red dot dancing and swooping against the vast blue canvas of the sky. She watched a group of friends playing frisbee, their movements easy and full of joy. Each of them was a story, a living, breathing narrative unfolding right in front of her. She felt a deep sense of contentment, a quiet happiness that was so different from the empty, sterile peace she used to feel. This was a full, rich, messy happiness, the kind that comes from being a part of the world, not just an observer of it. As she was about to start sketching the kite, her eyes fell on a young woman sitting on a bench a little way down the path. She couldn't have been more than 20, and she was alone. She was hunched over, her shoulders slumped, staring down at her phone as if it held the weight of the world. Every few minutes she would look up, scan the crowds in the park with a desperate, hopeful expression, and then her face would fall when she didn't see who she was looking for. She would wipe at her eyes with the back of her hand, a small, defeated gesture. She looked completely and utterly lost. Watching her, she felt a strange sense of déjà vu. It was like looking at a ghost from her own past, a younger version of herself trapped behind that invisible wall. She remembered that feeling, that crushing sense of loneliness in a crowd, the feeling of being invisible. She saw the same quiet desperation in the young woman's slumped shoulders that she had felt in her own heart for so many years. For a moment she hesitated. It wasn't her business. It would be awkward to intrude. What if the young woman told her to go away? The old fear, the fear of rejection, of saying the wrong thing, flickered inside her. But then she thought of the old man in the bookstore. She thought of his kindness, of the way he had reached out to her without even knowing her. She thought of the baker and his sourdough, of the woman with the kind eyes and her story about the creek. She thought of all the stories she had heard, all the connections she had made. and she knew what she had to do. It wasn't a grand, heroic gesture. It was just a small, simple act of reaching out. She closed her sketchbook, stood up, and walked over to the young woman's bench. She didn't have a plan. She didn't know what she was going to say. She just knew she had to say something. She sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving a respectful space between them. The young woman looked up, her eyes red-rimmed and wary. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. The young woman just stared at her for a moment, surprised by the question. Then her face crumpled, and the tears she had been fighting back began to fall in earnest. "No," she sobbed, shaking her head. "No, I'm not." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She just sat there and she listened. The young woman poured out her heart. She was supposed to meet a friend from back home who was visiting the city for the first time. They had planned this day for weeks, but her friend had just texted her, canceling at the last minute with a flimsy excuse. She was alone in a huge, intimidating city with no one to talk to and nowhere to go. She felt stupid and lonely and let down. She didn't offer any solutions. She didn't say, "Oh, you'll make other friends," or "There are plenty of things to do here." She just listened. She nodded. She made small, encouraging sounds, and she offered the young woman a clean tissue from her bag. She let her tell her story, and in the telling, she could see some of the tension leave the young woman's shoulders. When the story was finished and the tears had subsided, there was a comfortable silence between them. "I'm sorry," the young woman said, wiping her eyes. "I don't even know you." "That's okay," she replied with a warm smile. "Sometimes it's easier to talk to a stranger." They sat for a while longer, not saying much. She pointed out the kite still dancing in the sky. They watched a determined squirrel try to carry a nut that was twice its size. They shared small, simple observations about the world around them, building a tiny, temporary bridge of connection between them. After a while, the young woman's phone buzzed again. It was her brother checking in on her. She typed out a reply, a small smile on her face. "I think I'm going to be okay," she said, looking up from her phone. "My brother's going to come meet me. He lives here too." "That's good," she said. "That's really good." The young woman stood up to leave. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere. "Thank you for just sitting with me." "You're welcome," she replied. "I hope the rest of your day is better." "I think it will be," the young woman said, and she meant it. She watched her walk away, her steps a little lighter than they had been before. She sat back down on her bench, a feeling of quiet warmth spreading through her chest. She hadn't solved the young woman's problems. She hadn't fixed her life. All she had done was offer a moment of kindness, a moment of human connection. But it was enough. It was more than enough. As she sat there, she thought about the old man. She hadn't seen him in a few months. The story salon was still going strong, now run by the baker and the woman with the kind eyes. The old man had decided to retire, to move to a small cottage by the sea to finally write down his own stories. He had left the bookstore in the care of his community, a trust that they had all taken to heart. She thought about the way he had changed her world. He hadn't given her a magic potion or a secret map. He had done something much simpler and much more powerful. He had shown her how to look at the world differently. He had taught her that everyone has a story, and that the greatest adventure you can have is to listen to them. He had helped her see that her own life was a story worth telling, and that she had the power to be the author of her own next chapter. Helping that young woman in the park, she realized, was the final, perfect echo of his kindness. It was the full circle. He had helped a stranger, and in doing so, he had changed her world forever. And now she had helped a stranger, not to change her whole world, but maybe, just maybe, to change a single afternoon. It was a small act, but it was a thread in the great, messy, beautiful tapestry of human connection. She picked up her sketchbook again. She turned to a fresh page and began to draw. She didn't draw the kite or the couple or the squirrel. She drew a bench. And on one end of the bench, she drew a woman with a sketchbook in her lap. And on the other end, she drew a young woman, her head bowed, a single tear on her cheek. And between them, she drew a tiny, glowing thread of light connecting them. It was a story. Her story, and it was just getting started.